The morning Susanna Pritchard stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1878, she had exactly $47 sewn into the hem of her dress, a carpet bag containing everything she owned in this world, and a letter from a man she had never met promising her a proper home on good land with a sound roof over her head. She stood in the red dust of the main street and read that letter one more time, her lips moving slightly over the words she had memorized somewhere between St. Louis and the Oklahoma border. Thomas Blackwell, rancher, age 29, sought a wife of good character and industrious nature. He had written that he was building a house on his property, that the land was fertile and the future was bright, and that a woman of her caliber deserved nothing less than a solid foundation beneath her feet. He had underlined the word home twice, as though he wanted to make certain she understood the weight of that promise. Susanna had understood it very well. She was 24 years old, a schoolteacher from Cincinnati whose school had burned down in January, whose mother had passed the previous autumn, and whose landlord had raised the rent 3 times before Christmas. The advertisement in the Cincinnati Gazette had read like a prayer answered before she had even thought to ask it, and she had written back the very same afternoon. Now she stood in the dust and the wind and looked up and down the street of Caldwell, which smelled of horse and leather and something frying in grease somewhere nearby, and she told herself that whatever came next, she had survived worse. She squared her shoulders, picked up her carpet bag, and walked toward the livery stable where Thomas Blackwell had promised in his last letter to meet her. He was there. She knew him immediately, not because he matched any description he had given of himself, for he had given very little, but because he was the only man standing alone near the stable door with his hat in his hands, turning the brim around and around in a nervous circle. He was tall and lean in the way that hard work makes a man lean, with dark hair that wanted cutting and sun-darkened skin and brown eyes that, when they found hers across the yard, seemed startled, as though he had expected her to be something other than what she was. She was not certain what she had expected of him either, but the sight of him, with that revolving hat and that uncertain expression, made something in her chest loosen just slightly. "Miss Pritchard," he said. His voice was low and careful, like a man who chose his words deliberately because he had learned young that the wrong ones cost too much. "Mr. Blackwell," she replied, and she put out her hand to shake his the way her father had taught her to shake any hand, firm and direct. He looked at her hand for just a moment before he shook it, and she noticed that his palm was rough as bark, and that he let go perhaps a half-second too quickly. "You have luggage," he said, looking at her carpet bag. "This is it," she told him. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of something that might have been relief or might have been guilt, and she filed it away in the back of her mind the way she had always filed things that did not yet make sense, patiently waiting for more information. He had a wagon. It was a good wagon, well-maintained, with a horse that was clearly well-fed and well cared for. This told her more about Thomas Blackwell than any letter had, because a man who kept his animals well was a man who understood that the things dependent on him deserved his best effort. She climbed up to the seat without waiting for help, and she heard him exhale behind her in a way that she thought might mean he had expected to need to offer it. The ride to his property took the better part of 2 hours. The land around Caldwell was wide and spare and beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they stop trying to be anything other than what they are. The sky was enormous and the grass was the new green of April, and the wind moved through it in long, rolling waves that made it look like something breathing. Susanna watched it and felt, for the first time in months, something that she might have called peace. Thomas talked a little. He told her about the cattle, of which he had a small but growing herd. He told her about his neighbor to the south, a man named Garrett Webb who had been running cattle in these parts for 15 years and who had been generous with advice if not always with actual neighborly warmth. He told her about the town of Caldwell, that it was a trail town and could get rough at the end of the cattle drives, but that his property was 7 miles out and mostly quiet. He did not tell her about the house. She understood why when they turned off the main trail and followed a two-rut track through a stand of cottonwoods and came out into a broad, flat clearing where his cattle grazed in a field fenced with post and wire, where a windmill turned slowly near a water tank, where a vegetable garden had been started and already showed green rows of something just pushing through the soil, and where, instead of a house, there stood a barn. It was a good barn. She could see that immediately. It was solidly built of good lumber, with a sound roof and a wide door that stood open to show the clean, swept interior where his horses occupied 2 stalls and hay was stacked high in the loft above. It was, as barns went, an excellent barn. It was not a house. She sat on the wagon seat and looked at it for a long moment. The wind moved through the cottonwoods and made a sound like rushing water. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark called 3 clear notes and then went quiet. Thomas Blackwell had gone very still beside her. His jaw was set and his eyes were forward, and his hands held the reins in a grip that was tighter than it needed to be. She could see from his posture that he was braced for something, anger perhaps, or tears or accusations. He had, she realized, known all along what she would find when she arrived, and he had not told her because he had not known how, or because some part of him had hoped that the journey would soften the landing, or because he was a man who did not yet know how to say the hard things out loud. Susanna Pritchard looked at the barn. Then she looked at the land around it, the green fields and the wide sky and the windmill turning and the neat rows of the garden. She thought about the $47 in her hem. She thought about the burned school in Cincinnati and the raised rent, and the grave that was her mother's, and the empty rooms of a life that had stopped fitting her like clothing she had outgrown. Then she picked up her carpetbag and climbed down from the wagon. "It has a good roof," she said. Thomas turned and looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read, something between relief and shame, and a kind of wondering that he was clearly unprepared for. "Miss Pritchard, the garden is already started," she said, walking toward it. "What did you plant?" He was quiet for a moment. "Then beans, squash, some corn toward the back, tomatoes if they take." "They will take," she said with the certainty of a woman who had grown up helping her mother tend a kitchen garden in Ohio. "You have good southern exposure here." She walked to the barn and looked inside. The floor was hard-packed earth, swept clean. The 2 stalls were occupied by a bay mare and a dark roan gelding, both of whom turned to look at her with the mild interest of horses who have not decided yet whether a new person is worth their trouble. The loft was accessible by a good ladder of solid wood. Along the east wall, there was a long workbench with tools hung above it on iron hooks. Near the back, partially screened by a wooden partition that had been built in an obvious hurry and with less skill than the rest of the barn, was a narrow cot with a wool blanket, a washstand with a cracked mirror, and a small iron stove of the kind used for cooking. She looked at all of it carefully. Thomas had followed her inside and stood now near the door with his hat still in his hands, turning the brim again, and she thought that this nervous habit of his was perhaps the most honest thing about him. "Is there lumber?" she asked. He blinked. "I have some, what's left from the barn, and there's a sawmill in town." "Paper?" she asked. "And whitewash?" "I can get whitewash from Garrett Webb. He keeps it for his fences." Susanna set her carpetbag on the workbench and turned to face him fully. He was watching her with those brown eyes that she thought must be very hard to lie to, because they seemed to look for the truth of things automatically, the way a tracking dog goes to the ground. "Mr. Blackwell," she said, "I came here to build a life, not to find one already built. I would have preferred to know what was here before I arrived. But I am here now, and I am not the kind of woman who leaves because things are harder than promised." He swallowed. "I am sorry, Miss Pritchard. I meant to have more done. The lumber got delayed. The rains last fall took most of my savings, and he started again. I should have told you the truth." "Yes," she said simply. "You should have, but since we are dealing in truth now, I will tell you mine. I can work. I can build. I can make something from not much because that is what I was raised to do. What I need from you is an honest account of what you have and what you can get, and your word that when I ask you a direct question you will give me a direct answer." He looked at her for a long, careful moment. "You have it," he said. "Good," said Susanna, and she began to unpack her carpetbag. He slept that first night in the hayloft, having moved his cot up there without her asking, and she arranged the space behind the wooden partition with the small precision of a woman who had spent years making student dormitories and boarding house rooms feel habitable by the pure application of order and intention. She hung her second dress on a hook near the stove. She set her books on the workbench, which she converted to a shelf simply by clearing the tools to a new arrangement. She put her mother's blue ceramic dish on the washstand beside the cracked mirror and looked at it for a moment in the lamplight, and then she blew the lamp out and lay down on the narrow cot and listened to the sound of the Kansas night. It was very large, the night out here. It had sounds she was not accustomed to, the long calling of coyotes and the wind through the cottonwoods and the occasional soft movement of the horses in their stalls. But underneath all of it there was a stillness that was different from the stillness of Cincinnati, which had always been the stillness of a city pretending to be quiet. This was genuine. This was the quiet of a place that did not know how to be otherwise. She slept better than she had in months. The next morning she was up before Thomas. She had found flour and lard and salt the night before when she looked over the provisions shelf he kept in the barn, and she made biscuits on the small iron stove, and they were done before he climbed down the loft ladder, his hair rough from sleeping and his boots unlaced. He stopped at the bottom of the ladder and looked at her standing at the stove with her hair braided back and flour on her hands, and a cracked skillet of biscuits sitting on the iron surface. And he had an expression on his face that she could not immediately categorize. "I did not expect," he started, and then stopped. "Sit down," she told him. "We should talk about what comes first." They sat across from each other on two overturned crates and ate hot biscuits and talked logistics. She had a natural talent for organization that she had always attributed to her years in the classroom, where 30 children would descend into chaos in the space of 30 seconds if you were not always several steps ahead of them. She took stock of what he had with the same methodical attention she had once applied to dividing students into reading groups. He had 6 good horses, the cattle herd of approximately 40 head with room to grow, good water from the well, and the creek that ran along the south edge of his property, productive land that would support crops beyond the garden if properly cultivated, and the barn that was sound and dry and large enough to be genuinely useful if properly arranged. What he did not have was a second pair of hands for the daily work, which had clearly been exhausting him. He was thin in the way a man gets thin when he is working from before dawn to after dark every day, and not eating properly, because eating properly takes time he does not have. She looked at him across their 2 crates with their biscuits and said, "What did you eat yesterday before I arrived?" He thought about it. "Hardtack," he admitted, "and some jerky on the wagon. And before that, I had beans 2 days ago." Susanna nodded. This was, she understood, not a man who was careless with himself. This was a man who was simply overwhelmed, who was trying to build something large enough for a future that kept outpacing his present, and who had made a promise he could not yet keep, not out of dishonesty, but out of the desperate optimism of someone who believed very hard in what he was trying to do. She found she understood that particular form of optimism quite well. "All right," she said. "Here is what I think. We begin with the barn. I need it to be livable through the summer at minimum. That means proper walls on the partition, a proper floor in the back section if we can manage it, and a way to cook and wash and sleep with some dignity. Then we look at what we can put together toward a real house in the fall." He looked at the partition he had built, which was rough and gapped and clearly the work of a man whose skills ran to cattle and not carpentry. "I am not much for fine building," he said carefully. "I noticed," said Susanna without cruelty, "but I am." He looked at her then with what she was beginning to recognize as his most direct expression, the one where his brows came slightly together and his eyes went still, and he was working to understand something that surprised him. "You build." "I helped my father rebuild the kitchen of our house after the wall caved in one winter," she said. "I have set posts and hung doors and patched plaster. I am not a carpenter by trade, but I understand the principles." "I see," said Thomas Blackwell, and there was something in the way he said it that made her think he was revising a number of assumptions he had made about her between reading her letters in Cincinnati and watching her step off the stage in Caldwell. Good, she thought. Better to know each other truly than to spend a year being surprised. They went into town that afternoon for supplies. Caldwell in the spring of 1878 was a busy and sometimes rowdy place, positioned as it was at the southern end of the Kishom Trail, where Texas cattle drives would arrive in their thousands through the summer months. The main street was wide enough for wagon teams to pass, lined with a combination of wooden storefronts and canvas-walled establishments that went up and came down with the season. There was a general store, a hotel, a barber, a lawyer's office, a cattle buyer's shed, 2 saloons, a church that doubled as a school, and a small doctor's office above the hardware store. The man who ran the general store was named Hector Bream, a short, broad man of about 50, with a white mustache and shrewd eyes, who had clearly heard of Thomas's arrangement, and looked Susanna over with an expression that was not quite skeptical, but was definitely evaluating. She bought what she needed with 2 of her $47 and told Hector Bream exactly what she needed it for, and by the time she was done listing the lumber dimensions and the amount of whitewash and the quantity of cotton ticking she required for a proper mattress, his expression had shifted from evaluating to something considerably more respectful. "You know what you are about, Miss Pritchard," he said. "I generally do," she agreed pleasantly. In the wagon on the way back, Thomas said nothing for a mile or 2. Then he said, "People will talk about us living in the barn together before the wedding." Susanna had been watching a hawk circling over the grass to the south and did not look at him when she answered. "Then we should not give them long to talk," she said. "Is there a pastor in Caldwell?" He was quiet for another moment. "Reverend Moss," he said. "He comes through on the first Sunday of each month." "Then when he comes next," she said, "we should speak to him." She felt Thomas look at her from the side, and she turned to meet his gaze steadily. He had a way of going very still when he was thinking hard about something, and he was very still now. "You would marry me," he said. "It was not quite a question." "That was the arrangement when I answered your advertisement," she said. "I have not changed my mind, have you?" Something in his expression shifted, a slight softening around the eyes that she had not seen before. "No," he said, "I have not." "Then we will speak to Reverend Moss," she said, and turned back to watch the hawk. In the 2 weeks before Reverend Moss arrived for his monthly circuit, Susanna Pritchard remade the inside of the barn. She was systematic about it in the way she was systematic about everything, starting with what was most necessary and moving outward from there. She and Thomas worked the partition wall together after supper each evening, and she directed the process with the confidence of someone who had studied the problem thoroughly. The gap at the bottom was filled with cut boards nailed flush. The gap at the top was closed with a framework of lighter lumber. She mixed whitewash from the supply Garrett Webb had brought over, delivered by his hired hand, with a note that said simply, "Heard you were settling in. Welcome to the territory," which she thought was a decent thing for a man to do, even if his handwriting suggested he had learned to write in a hurry. She whitewashed the inside of her partition section until it was bright and clean. The cracked mirror she cleaned and reset in a proper frame she made from scrap wood, and it hung straight on the whitewashed wall and reflected back the lamplight, so the space felt twice as large. The cot she rebuilt with new rope webbing strung between a proper wooden frame Thomas cut for her, and she filled the cotton ticking with dried prairie grass, and then with fresh straw from the loft, which smelled clean and green and not unpleasant at all. She found, in a box in the corner of the workbench, a collection of items that Thomas had apparently been saving without any clear plan for them. There were 3 tin cups, a set of mismatched cutlery, a length of blue calico fabric that had probably been intended for a curtain at some point, and a small wooden box that, when she opened it, contained a collection of river stones, smooth and various in color, that had clearly been gathered over a long time because no one picks up that many pretty stones in an afternoon. She sat with that box for a moment, turning one of the stones over in her fingers. The stones said something about Thomas Blackwell that his letters had not, something about a man who noticed small, beautiful things and kept them, even when he could not say exactly why. She used the blue calico for curtains over the 2 small windows she convinced him to cut in the east wall of her section, each framed in lumber and fitted with proper shutters that she designed, and he executed with the careful labor of a man whose hands were more accustomed to roping cattle than measuring wood, but who was capable of precision when given clear instruction. The curtains turned the morning light into something soft and blue, and when she hung them and stood back to look at them, Thomas came in from the yard and stood behind her and looked at the same thing and said, very quietly, "That's something." "It's just curtains," she said. "No," he said just as quietly. "It is not just curtains." She did not answer, but she felt the heat rise in her face, which was unusual, because Susanna Pritchard had not blushed since she was 16. She began cooking properly, which transformed Thomas in visible ways within about 4 days. He ate what she put in front of him with the concentrated attention of someone who has been genuinely hungry for a long time, not desperately hungry but chronically, persistently underfed. And within the first week, the sharpness in his face had softened slightly, and he moved with a little more ease, and a little less of the rigid determination of a man running on nothing but will. He was good company when he was not braced against something. She had not expected that. She had expected him to be taciturn in the way of men who live alone a long time, and he was that somewhat, but he was also genuinely curious about things, about the books she had brought with her, and the places she had been, and the children she had taught, and the way the school had burned, and what she had done afterward while she was waiting for things to become clear again. He asked questions and listened to the answers with the same quality of attention he gave to the land when he was reading weather or tracking an animal's movement through the grass. She liked talking to him. She had not anticipated liking it. Reverend Moss came on the first Sunday of May, a small dry man in a black coat who drove his own buggy and preached in the Caldwell church to whatever congregation assembled, which on that particular Sunday included about 30 people and a dog that came in through the open door and sat in the back pew and was not asked to leave. Susanna and Thomas sat side by side in the second row because Thomas had arrived late and the front row was already full, and at some point during the sermon about steadfastness in difficult conditions, Thomas's hand, resting on his knee, was close enough to hers that their fingers were nearly touching, and neither of them moved away. After the service, they spoke to Reverend Moss in the church yard under the elm tree that someone had planted there 20 years ago, and that was now large enough to give meaningful shade. Thomas introduced her as his intended, and Reverend Moss looked at her with eyes that were kind and careful. "You came out on the understanding that there would be a proper house," he said, "and it was not quite a question." "I came out on the understanding that we would build a life together," Susanna said. "The specifics are being negotiated." Reverend Moss looked at Thomas, who met the look steadily. Then the Reverend smiled, a small, clean smile. "Saturday afternoon, then," he said. "I will be in Caldwell through Saturday." They were married on a Saturday afternoon in May of 1878 in the Caldwell church, with Hector Bream and his wife, Adelaide, as witnesses, and 3 other people from town who had heard about it, and came out of what Susanna suspected was a combination of goodwill and curiosity. Adelaide Bream brought a small wedding cake that she had baked that morning, and which was slightly lopsided but very good, made with dried apples and a sprinkling of cinnamon. Susanna wore her best dress, which was dark green wool and too warm for May, but was the nicest thing she owned, And Thomas wore a clean shirt and his best boots and had gotten his hair cut at last, which made him look younger and slightly uncertain in a way that she found, without quite meaning to, charming. Reverend Moss married them with the serious and tender care of a man who took the word seriously. And when he said the part about love and honor and cherish, Thomas turned to look at her with an expression so unguarded that she had to look away for a moment to collect herself. When it was done, and Reverend Moss said he could kiss his bride, Thomas leaned in and pressed his lips to her cheek, careful and brief, and she felt the warmth of it long after they had shaken hands with everyone and eaten lopsided wedding cake, and climbed into the wagon to drive home under a sky that was going rose and gold at the edges. The drive home was quiet. Not the awkward quiet of two strangers, but the more complicated quiet of two people who are now something to each other and are still working out exactly what that means. "I do not know," Thomas said at last, when they were most of the way home, "that I have ever been as glad about anything as I was this afternoon." Susanna kept her eyes on the road ahead. "That is a good thing to say," she told him. "I mean it." "I know you do," she said. "That is why it is a good thing." She heard him breathe out slowly. Then, "You are not what I expected." "What did you expect?" He was quiet for a moment, which she understood by now was him thinking carefully rather than avoiding the question. "I thought you would be more frightened. Of the uncertainty of it, most women would be. Coming out here to a barn," she said, without heat. "To a barn," he agreed, and there was something in his voice that she recognized as the specific pain of a man who has been carrying his own failure close to him for a long time. "I expected you to be angry, or disappointed in a way you could not hide, and instead he stopped. Instead I made curtains," she said. "Instead you made it a home," he said, and his voice had dropped so low she almost did not hear it over the sound of the wagon wheels. She turned to look at him then. He was watching the road, his jaw set, his hands easy on the reins now that he was on familiar ground, and the last light of the evening lay along the line of his profile, and she thought with a clarity that surprised her with its force that she was glad to be here. Not glad in spite of everything, not glad as a compensation for what was difficult. Just simply, straightforwardly, genuinely glad. "Thomas," she said. He turned. "You owe me a house," she said. "Eventually." He held her gaze for a moment, and then the corner of his mouth curved upward in what was, she realized, the first smile she had seen from him that was genuinely unguarded, that came from somewhere easy and real. "Eventually," he agreed. She looked forward again. The cottonwoods of their property were visible now in the dusk, dark shapes against the paling sky, and the windmill turned steadily against the evening. Their life together organized itself with the practicality of people who are both sensible and busy. The barn, under Susanna's continued attention, underwent a gradual transformation that happened so steadily and so incrementally that Thomas later said he had not noticed it happening until one morning he looked up from saddling the bay mare and realized that what he was standing in no longer resembled a barn from the inside at all. She built shelves along the east wall from wood she negotiated for from Hector Bream at a rate that she later told Thomas was probably better than he could have gotten himself, which he did not dispute. The shelves held the kitchen supplies she slowly accumulated, canned goods and dried herbs, and a row of pickle jars she put up that summer from the garden, which turned out extraordinary, far beyond the modest expectations Thomas had had for it when he planted those first hopeful rows in March. Susanna understood soil and water and the direction of light in a way that was almost intuitive, and she expanded the garden steadily through the summer, adding potatoes and onions and 2 kinds of beans, and a long row of sunflowers along the south fence that she said were not strictly practical, but that she intended to have anyway. "Everything needs something beautiful that is not useful," she told Thomas when he looked at the sunflowers with his considering expression, the one where he was assessing whether a thing was worth its resources. He looked at the sunflowers. He looked at her. "Yes," he said, and seemed to mean something beyond just the flowers. She embroidered 2 cushions for the crate chairs that had become their regular seating at the small table she constructed from 2 planks, and a pair of sawhorses that she subsequently made permanent by adding proper legs. Thomas watched her embroider in the evenings, her head bent over the work in the lamplight, her fingers moving with an efficiency that made the complicated thing look simple. And she would sometimes look up and catch him watching, and he would look away, and she would look back down at her work and feel that warmth again in her face. They were careful with each other in the early months, as newly married people are when they have come to each other through the measured language of correspondence rather than the disorderly path of courtship. They knew each other's habits before they knew each other's hearts, and the habits were the bridge they used. She knew that he was up before dawn every morning, and that he moved through the early hours with a quiet efficiency that she admired. She knew that he came in at midday and ate whatever she had ready with genuine gratitude and left again without lingering, and she understood this not as dismissal, but as the rhythm of a man who had work that mattered to him and took it seriously. She knew that in the evenings, when the work was done and the horses settled, he would sit across from her at the small table and sometimes talk and sometimes just sit, and that both were comfortable. He knew that she read every night before sleeping, that she carried an annotation pencil and underlined passages in her books, and sometimes read passages aloud when she found ones that seemed important, not to him particularly, but to the room, the way some people pray aloud. He knew that she hummed when she worked, not songs exactly, but a sort of continuous melodic running through of something that was not quite a tune but had a shape. He knew that she had not cried since she arrived, not once, even on the days when things went wrong, when the stove smoked, when a late frost threatened the garden, when a snake got into the barn and had to be dealt with, and he thought that this was not because she did not feel things fully, but because she kept her grief private and her practicality public, which he understood as a form of dignity that he deeply respected. The summer brought with it the cattle drives and the influx of cowboys and buyers and general chaos that Caldwell was known for along the trail, and Susanna went into town less during the peak months of June and July, when the streets were full and loud and occasionally dangerous. She was not afraid exactly, but she was practical about which situations were worth navigating and which were not, and a trail-end town full of cowboys who had been 3 months on the road from Texas was a situation that could be navigated perfectly well by staying home and attending to the garden. Thomas went to town when he needed to and came home always by dark, and on the rare nights when a cattle deal kept him later than expected, he sent word by whoever was heading west out of Caldwell, which was usually someone going close enough to give the message. He was punctual about it, and she recognized punctuality in such things as its own form of kindness. It was in July that she began to draw up plans for the house. She did it in pencil on the back of old newspaper, sitting at the table in the evenings while Thomas read through his cattle records and invoices, and she drew with careful precision the kind of floor plan her father had once showed her how to read, the rooms marked with their measurements, the windows positioned for light and air, the door openings angled for the prevailing wind. One evening Thomas leaned over to look at what she was drawing, and she passed it to him without comment. He held it and studied it for a long time, turning it slightly to read the notations she had made along the margins about materials and construction sequence. "You drew this," he said. "I need something to work toward," she said, "and it is easier to build if you know what you are building before you start." He set the paper down on the table between them and smoothed it with the flat of his hand. The house she had drawn was not large, 4 rooms on the ground floor with a proper kitchen and a sitting room and 2 bedrooms and a proper porch running along the front, and the walls were positioned to take the morning light in the kitchen and the evening light in the sitting room. He studied it with the same quality of attention he gave the land, looking for what it meant, what it said about its maker. "You have been planning this since you arrived," he said. "Since before I arrived," she admitted. "On the stagecoach I had time to think." He was quiet for a moment, Then in the fall when I sell the herd I should have enough for lumber and nails, maybe enough for windows if we are careful." "We will be careful," she said. He reached across the table and put his finger on the porch she had drawn, running it along the line. "The porch is generous," he said. "I want somewhere to sit in the evenings," she said. He looked up from the paper. "So do I," he said softly, and she was aware again of that particular warmth, the one that lived behind her sternum and came forward when he looked at her a certain way. She said before she could lose her nerve, "Thomas, are you content here? With this arrangement with me?" The question surprised him, she could see that, and she watched him consider it the way he considered everything important, not quickly but honestly. "I have not been content," he said slowly, "in a long time. Not since my mother died and my father sold the farm back in Tennessee, and I came out here with nothing but what I could carry and the idea that I could make something from it." He paused. "But since you came, I have been content nearly every day. Not because things are easy. Things are not easy, but because I am not doing it alone anymore, and because—" He stopped again. "Because," she prompted. His eyes met hers directly. "Because you are remarkable, Susanna, and being near remarkable things makes ordinary life feel less ordinary." She had not expected that. She had expected something more cautious from him, more hedged, and the directness of it caught her without her usual composure, and she looked down at the plans and busied herself with straightening the paper. "That is a generous thing to say," she said. "I said I would give you direct answers," he said. "You have kept your end of that. I mean to keep mine." She looked up again. In the lamplight his face was warm and his eyes were steady, and she thought that this was, without her planning for it or expecting it, a man she was falling in love with. Not the fast, breathless fall of the novels she had read as a girl, but something steadier and stronger, like the current of the creek on his south property line, consistent and deep and moving always forward. "I am content too," she said. "More than I expected to be." He smiled, that real unguarded smile, and looked back at the plans, and she looked back at them too, and the lamp burned steadily between them. August brought a complication that had a name: Earl Duggan. Earl Duggan was a cattle buyer from Wichita who had been coming through Caldwell at the end of the summer drives for several years, and who had, it turned out, had some kind of prior business arrangement with Thomas, before Thomas's finances had gone sideways in the floods of the previous autumn. He arrived one late August afternoon in a good coat and a bad temper, and informed Thomas that he was owed $40 from a previous transaction that had not been settled, and that he wanted it now, or he would involve the sheriff. Susanna, who was in the garden when she heard the raised voices, and came through the garden gate to find the two men squared off in the yard, assessed the situation in approximately 4 seconds. She had seen men argue about money before, had watched her father navigate similar confrontations with the careful dignity of a man who understood that losing your temper in a financial dispute was the same as losing the dispute. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked over. "Mr. Duggan," she said clearly, and both men turned. Earl Duggan looked at her with the particular surprise of a man who has been focused on his opponent and has not noticed that the landscape has added a new feature. He was a large man, broad and florid-faced, with the look of someone who ate well and often. "This does not concern you, ma'am," he said, and his tone was not quite rude but was several degrees cooler than polite. "My husband's debts concern me very much," she said pleasantly, and she watched Thomas's expression shift at the word husband, that slight but real shift of someone who has been reminded of something they are glad about. "And I would like to hear the full account of this debt before anyone decides on the best way to settle it." Thomas looked at her. She gave him a brief, calm look that she hoped communicated "trust me." Something in him settled. It took 15 minutes of careful questioning to establish that the $40 was legitimately owed, that Duggan had documentation to support his claim, and that the debt originated from a cattle deal the previous summer where Thomas had taken delivery of a consignment on credit with the intention of paying at the fall sale. Only the fall sale had been complicated by the flooding, and the delay had stretched past the agreed-upon date. None of it was dishonest on Thomas's part. All of it was genuinely owed. "We do not have $40 in hand," Susanna said, after she had understood the full picture. "But we have a fine kitchen garden and a smokehouse that we built this past month." They had indeed built a small smokehouse, one of Susanna's projects, in which they had been curing pork from a hog Thomas had purchased in June. "I can offer you enough salt pork to fill the back of your wagon, Mr. Duggan, which at current Caldwell prices is worth $40 and possibly more. Or we can offer you the equivalent in cattle from this fall's sale with a written agreement specifying the date and amount." Duggan looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Thomas. Then he looked back at her. "You drive a fair bargain, Mrs. Blackwell," he said, and there was a reluctant respect in it. "I prefer to drive an honest one," she said. They settled the debt with a written agreement on the fall cattle sale, which Thomas honored to the letter in October, and Earl Duggan went back to Wichita somewhat less irate than he had arrived. And when his wagon was out of sight, Thomas turned to look at Susanna standing in the yard with her apron still on from the garden and said, very quietly, "Thank you. We are partners," she said simply. He looked at her for a long moment in the late summer sun, and then he crossed the yard and did something he had not done before. He put his hand against her face, his rough, careful, bark-like hand, and turned it up toward him and looked at her for a moment, studying her the way he studied the land, for truth and depth and what was really there. Then he leaned in and kissed her, not on the cheek this time but on the mouth, gently and with absolute sincerity. She kissed him back. When they separated, she was breathing slightly unevenly, and he looked as though he had resolved something that had been unsettled in him for a while. "I have wanted to do that," he said, "since about the third morning when I came down from the loft and you had biscuits ready." She laughed. It surprised them both, the laugh full and real. "Biscuits," she said. "I'm a simple man," he said, but his eyes were warm and not simple at all. "No," she told him, "you are not." He took her hand and held it. They stood in the yard in the August sun, the windmill turning slowly behind them, and the cattle moving in the distant field, and the sunflowers along the south fence all facing the same direction like an audience watching something worth watching. The fall sale came, and Thomas made more than he had expected, the herd having filled out well over the summer on the good grass, and the careful management they had given it together, because Susanna had turned out to have an eye for cattle conditions, and had been quietly learning everything she could about the business since her first week on the property. She asked questions and read everything Hector Bream had in the way of agricultural pamphlets, and listened carefully when Thomas talked to Garrett Webb about grazing patterns and water management. Thomas paid Earl Duggan and paid Hector Bream for the running account and paid a debt in Wichita that he had not told Susanna about, not from dishonesty but from the lingering embarrassment of it, and she found out when the receipt came with the mail, and she did not reproach him for it but simply said, "In the future, please tell me," and he said he would and he meant it. What remained after all debts were settled was more than he had hoped. Not enough for a full house, but enough for a start. He told her one evening in September, sitting at the table with the fall account spread between them. "I think we can start the house before the ground freezes," he said. "The foundation, at least. The frame, if the weather holds." She looked at the plans she had drawn in July, which had been living on the shelf above the book since then, occasionally taken down and revised. She had revised them 3 times. The house had grown slightly with each revision, not larger but more thoughtful, with details she had added as she understood better what the Kansas winters required: a deep-root cellar, a proper chimney with 2 flues, a back entrance that came in through a mudroom so the main room stayed clean. "The foundation first," she agreed, "and the frame, the interior can wait." Thomas looked at the plans and then looked at her. There was something in his expression that had been building for a while, something that was not quite guilt anymore but was related to it, a kind of aching tenderness. "Susanna," he said, "I want to tell you something." She waited. "When I wrote that advertisement," he said, "I was not entirely truthful, not about the house." He paused. "I know you know that, but it is more than that. I was also not truthful about why I wanted a wife. I told myself and I wrote that it was practical, that I needed a partner for the work, someone to share the load, which is true. But the truth underneath that was he stopped, started again. I was lonely. I had been lonely for a long time. And I thought if I said that, if I put that in an advertisement, that no woman would answer it because loneliness does not sound like a thing worth traveling 1,000 miles for. She looked at him steadily across the table. The lamp was burning and the autumn wind was beginning to speak outside through the cottonwoods, and the horses were quiet in their stalls beyond the wall. I would have answered it, she said. He looked at her. Loneliness, I understand, she said. It is more honest than most of what people put in advertisements. You were lonely too, he said, not as an accusation, just as recognition. Very, she said simply. He reached across the table and took both her hands in both of his. His hands were very warm and very steady. I love you, he said. I want to say it plainly with no hedging because you asked me for direct answers, and this is the most direct thing I can tell you. I love you, Susanna, and I am sorry it took me this many months to say it out loud. She turned his hands over in hers and looked at them, at the scars and the calluses and the care in them. Then she looked up at him. I love you too, Thomas, she said. I think I started somewhere around the river stones. He looked confused. The river stones. In the box on the workbench, she said. The smooth ones, you kept them. He was quiet for a moment. Then very softly, my mother used to collect them, along the creek where we lived in Tennessee. After she died, I started picking them up without meaning to. Susanna squeezed his hands. That is a good reason to keep beautiful things, she said. He came around the table and she stood, and he held her in the lamplight of the barn that she had made into something else entirely. The barn with its whitewashed walls and its blue curtains and its embroidered cushions and its full shelves and its warmth. And she pressed her face against his shoulder and felt him hold her carefully and completely, the way a man holds something he understands the value of. The foundation of the house went in before the first frost. Thomas and Susanna and 2 hired men from Caldwell digging, and setting the stone with the focused industry of people who have a clear vision and the determination to make it real. Garrett Webb came over one Saturday with his 2 ranch hands and helped without being asked, appearing at the edge of the property on a bright October morning and saying only, 4 pair of hands is faster than 2. And Susanna made dinner for all of them that evening with a generosity that made Garrett Webb look at Thomas with the expression of a man who has concluded that his neighbor has done something extremely right. The frame went up before the hard cold came and stood through the winter like a promise kept partway, the ribs of the house visible against the white sky, snow collecting on the horizontal beams and then sliding off in the January sun. Susanna looked at it every morning from the barn doorway with the same feeling she had once looked at her half-finished lesson plans for the school year, the satisfaction of a thing in progress, of a future taking form. The winter was cold and long, and they spent it close together in the barn, which by January Susanna thought of without any self-consciousness as their home, because she had made it one. Thomas read to her sometimes in the evenings, choosing passages from her books with a careful randomness that always seemed to land on something interesting, and she began to understand that his quiet was not emptiness but depth, that he contained multitudes in the manner of a landscape that looks plain from a distance and turns complex and extraordinary when you come closer. She told him stories about the children she had taught, the particular genius of 10-year-olds for locating the exact point at which any rule became absurd, and he laughed in a way that always seemed to surprise him, as though he had not expected to be amused and was pleased to be wrong. She told him about Cincinnati and the river, and the way the city smelled in August when it was hot, and he told her about Tennessee and the mountains, and the kind of green that no Kansas prairie could match, which he said with the mild guilt of a man who loved where he had come from and did not want to be disloyal to where he was. In February she told him she was going to have a baby. She said it in the morning, when he came down from the loft, which he still used occasionally, although more and more often did not. She had been sitting at the table with a cup of coffee, and she watched him pour his own cup and sit down, and then she said it plainly because she had decided that directness was the only way she knew how to live. He set down his cup very carefully. Then he looked at her with an expression that she had not seen before on him, something so open and undefended that it made her feel suddenly tender in a way that was almost painful. "You are certain," he said. "Quite certain," she said. He was silent for a moment that lasted probably 5 seconds and felt much longer. Then he said, "The house will be done by the fall." "I know it will," she said. "I mean it, Susanna." "I will have the house done before Thomas," she said, with the gentleness of someone who has already settled the question in herself. "I know you will, and if you did not I would make do, but I know you will." He crossed to her and crouched beside her chair and took her face in his hands the way he had done that August day in the yard, with that same quality of looking, and she met his eyes directly. "Everything I have is yours," he said. "Everything I can make or build or earn or grow. You know that." "I know it," she said. He pressed his forehead against hers for a moment, and she put her hand against his jaw, and outside the February wind drove snow against the barn wall, and the horses moved in their stalls, and the lamp on the table burned steadily between the blue curtains. The spring of 1879 brought 3 things more or less simultaneously: the resumed construction of the house, a significant expansion of the cattle herd when Thomas bought 20 additional head from a seller in Wichita who was retiring his operation, and the appearance of Dorothea James. Dorothea James was about 45 and had come west from Missouri with her husband, who had died of fever outside of Dodge City in the previous October, and who had subsequently made her way to Caldwell with 2 children, a daughter named May, who was 11, and a son named Robbie, who was 8, and had been taking in laundry and mending in the town in exchange for room and board at the hotel. Susanna met her at the general store in March and recognized immediately, with the practical intuition of a woman who had been in need herself not so long ago, that Dorothea James was managing but only just. She spoke to Thomas that evening. "I would like to offer Mrs. James work," she said. "We are going to need help through the summer with the house being built and the cattle expanding and the baby coming." Thomas looked at her over his coffee. "What kind of work?" "Cooking and household when the house is ready. Garden work now. The children can help in the garden too, and May is old enough to be useful in several ways." She paused. "There is space in the barn for them while the house is being built. I can arrange it." He was quiet for a moment. "That is a generous thing," he said. "It is a practical thing," she said, though they both knew it was both. Dorothea James and her children moved into the barn in April, into the section Susanna had partitioned for herself that first week, which she had subsequently expanded and refined until it was a genuinely comfortable pair of rooms divided by a proper wall with a door. Dorothea wept the first time she saw what Susanna had made of the space, wept briefly and without self-consciousness, and then dried her eyes and said, "Tell me what you need done." And Susanna did, and they got along very well from the beginning. May James turned out to be remarkable in the garden, with an instinct for plants that reminded Susanna of her own mother. And Robbie, who was serious and careful and watched Thomas with the particular attention of a boy who is looking for a model of how men should be, became Thomas's shadow whenever the school day in town allowed, trailing after him through the cattle work with questions that Thomas answered with the patience of someone who took children's curiosity seriously. The house went up through the spring and into the summer, Thomas working before dawn and after dark on the days when the cattle work allowed, and hiring 2 skilled carpenters from Caldwell for the weeks when the structural work required expertise beyond what he could manage alone. Susanna, by now visibly pregnant and moving with the careful deliberateness of a woman who is adjusting to a new gravitational situation, directed the interior decisions with her usual precision, specifying window placements and door swings, and where the chimney should be positioned relative to the kitchen and the sitting room. She and Thomas argued once, productively and without real anger, about the kitchen. He thought it should be smaller to save materials. She thought it should be the largest room in the house on the ground floor, because the kitchen was where a family lived, where meals were made and children did homework and neighbors were welcomed, and a small kitchen made all of those things harder. He listened to her argument with his considering expression, and then he said, "All right." And the kitchen was made as she specified, large and well lit with 2 east windows and a big iron range that Hector Bream ordered specially from Kansas City. By the 1st of August, the house was roofed, and by mid-August it was plastered, and by the 1st of September the floors were laid in wide planks of good Kansas lumber that Susanna went over with linseed oil until they glowed in the afternoon light. On the 15th of September, 1879, Susanna and Thomas Blackwell moved into their house. Dorothea James had by then been offered a more permanent arrangement that included a small wage, which she accepted, and she and the children occupied a room above the barn that had been converted for them, with the kind of careful attention to livability that was becoming the signature of everything Susanna touched. The house was 4 rooms and a porch and a root cellar, and it stood on the Kansas prairie with its back to the north wind and its face to the morning sun. And Susanna stood on the front porch on the first morning and looked out at the land, at the cattle in the field and the windmill turning and the garden, now fully established and lavish with its August productivity, and the cottonwoods along the path in their first gold of autumn. And she breathed in the smell of new wood and linseed oil and the cold clarity of September air. Thomas came and stood behind her and put his arms around her, and she leaned back against him. Her pregnancy was very far along now, and she was aware of the weight and the reality of it in a way that was both daunting and something she could only describe as awe. "Is it what you wanted?" he asked, his voice close to her ear. She looked at the house, at the porch they were standing on, at the windows she had specified for their light and air, at the door she had chosen for its weight and its solid hang. "It is better," she said. He pressed his lips against her hair. "You made it better," he said. "You made all of it better, from the day you stepped off that stage with your $47 in your hem." She turned in his arms to look at him. "How do you know about the $47? He smiled, that real smile. "Adelaide Bream told me. She told me a lot about you actually, said you drove a harder bargain than most men she had ever seen and that you were going to be the making of this place." "Adelaide Bream is a perceptive woman," Susanna said. "She is," he agreed. "She was right." Susanna looked up at him in the September morning. "Thomas, I want to tell you something." "Tell me," he said, and the readiness in his face was the readiness of a man who has decided once and for good to be available to the truth of things. "I never said a word," she told him, "about the barn, about what you promised and what was here instead. Not because I was afraid to, but because I looked at what was here and I thought, this is enough to start with. This is enough to build from. And you," she put her hand flat against his chest, "you were enough to build with." He covered her hand with his. His eyes were very dark and very steady, and she thought he might say something, but instead he simply held her hand against his heart and looked at her with an expression that required no translation whatsoever. Their son was born on the 1st of October, 1879, in the new house in the big bedroom with the morning windows, delivered by the doctor from Caldwell who rode out in the dawn cold, and was there in time with room to spare. He was a large, healthy, furiously vocal baby who arrived with a clear sense of his own importance, and made it known immediately. Thomas, who had been instructed by the doctor to wait in the kitchen, and who had done so with the rigid stillness of a man exercising enormous self-control, came in when called, and looked at his son with an expression that Susanna would remember for the rest of her life, pure and absolute wonder, the wonder of a man who had built a great deal in his time on this earth, and understood that this was something altogether different. "He looks," Thomas said, searching for words and finding them imperfect, "like something that is going to be a great deal of trouble." "Good," said Susanna, who was very tired and very happy. "We can handle trouble." Thomas sat on the edge of the bed and took the baby and held him with the careful tension of a man who is holding something that terrifies him with its importance. And the baby immediately found his father's shirt collar fascinating and grabbed it with a grip that made Thomas's eyes go wide. Susanna watched her husband hold their son in the autumn morning light of the house she had made, and she thought that this was the kind of moment that a person carries inside them for the rest of their life, the kind you go back to when things are hard and remember why. They named him Joseph, after Thomas's father, which was Thomas's idea, and Susanna agreed immediately because she thought it was right that something of Thomas's past should live in this new thing they were making together. Dorothea James brought food and fussed over the baby with the delight of someone who loves children and has raised two and intends to be useful. May James came in and looked at Joseph with 11-year-old gravity and declared that he was very red but that she supposed that would improve. Robbie James came in and looked at the baby and then looked at Thomas and said, "Does it hurt them when they are born?" And Thomas, to his credit, said, "I believe so." "You should ask your mother. She would know better than I would," which was precisely the right answer and confirmed Susanna's long-held opinion that Thomas Blackwell was a better man than he generally gave himself credit for. The years that followed were good ones. Not without difficulty, because the Kansas Territory in the late 1870s and into the 1880s was still a place where droughts came and markets shifted, and the cattle business had its seasons of thinness and its seasons of plenty, and the politics of the territory made some years harder than others. There were times when money was tight and they economized carefully, and times when a good sale meant they could look at the future with something approaching ease. But in the essential things, in the things that mattered most, they were abundantly and specifically rich. The cattle herd grew. Thomas had a real instinct for the business that Susanna had recognized early, and that, over the years, expanded into a genuine expertise. He began buying and selling not just from his own herd, but as a buyer for others, developing the kind of reputation in the Caldwell cattle market that came from being consistently honest in your assessments and fair in your dealings, which turned out to be surprisingly rare and therefore surprisingly valuable. Susanna expanded her garden to a full kitchen operation and began supplying Hector Bream's general store with pickles and preserves and dried herbs on a commercial basis, which brought in a modest but consistent income that was entirely her own, which she used for the house. Every year the house gained something new. Proper wallpaper in the sitting room, which she hung herself with Thomas holding the paper while she applied it. A bookcase that Thomas built one winter using the skills he had slowly accumulated over years of watching her approach problems with precision. A piano in 1882 that came from Kansas City on the railroad, and that she played with the careful joy of someone returning to a beloved thing after a long absence, because she had grown up with a piano in the house and had missed it more than she expected. The morning the piano arrived, Thomas stood in the sitting room doorway and watched movers she had hired from Caldwell position it against the east wall, and when they were gone and the door was shut, and Susanna sat down on the bench and played the first notes, tentative and then more confident, something from Chopin that she had been carrying in her fingers since she was 15. Thomas sat down on the sofa and listened with his eyes slightly closed and an expression of absolute contentment. She played for half an hour without stopping. When she finally lifted her hands from the keys and turned to look at him, he opened his eyes. "We should have gotten that sooner," he said. "It was expensive," she said. "Some things are worth the expense," he said. In 1881 they had their second child, a girl they named Clara, who came into the world in an enormous hurry and with a determination that suggested she had places to be and things to do and was not interested in waiting. Joseph, who was 2, was deeply unimpressed by his sister's arrival and expressed this clearly for approximately 3 weeks before deciding, with the pragmatic flexibility of a toddler, that she was acceptable after all, particularly when she started laughing at his antics, which she began doing at an early age and never really stopped. In 1883, a late spring drought threatened to be serious, and Thomas rode into the Cherokee Strip south of Caldwell to arrange additional grazing for his cattle on the land that, before the allotment policies of recent years had begun to reshape the territory, had been used by various peoples for generations, and was now the subject of complicated and often unjust land arrangements that Thomas navigated with the careful discomfort of a man who understood that the land beneath his feet had a history that preceded him by a very long time. He told Susanna about these negotiations honestly, as he told her about everything, including the fact that the family he paid for the grazing rights was a Cherokee family who had held land there through arrangements that were being eroded by federal pressure year by year, and that he found this deeply uncomfortable even as he benefited from what remained of the arrangement. Susanna listened and said, "Then we pay them a fair price, a good one, not what you can get away with." "That is what I intended," he said. "Good," she said, "and we remember that what we have here was not built only by us." He looked at her for a moment. "No," he said, "it was not." They did not speak of it often after that, but they did not forget it either, and the way they ran their business reflected it, in the fairness of their dealings and the acknowledgement of what they owed to the people and the land that had made their prosperity possible. Dorothea James remained with them through all of this, her position gradually shifting from hired help to something closer to family, because that is what she became. May James grew into a serious, capable young woman who learned ranching and bookkeeping from Susanna, and who, in 1884, married a young man from Caldwell named Paul Winters, a carpenter who had come west from Indiana looking for work, and had found it and stayed. And Susanna made her wedding dress, and Thomas gave her away at the wedding, because they had both taken on that role without ever having formally decided to, which was how the best things in their life tended to happen. Robbie James, who had grown from the serious 8-year-old who asked Thomas about the pain of childbirth into a tall, capable young man of 15, continued to work on the Blackwell ranch and learn from Thomas with the dedication of a boy who has found what he wants to do and is wholly committed to it. Thomas taught him everything he knew about cattle and horses and land management, and Robbie absorbed it all with the same careful attention he had always paid to things. And by the time he was 19, he was the best hand on the property, and by 21, he was managing the day-to-day operation of the herd with a competence that allowed Thomas to expand his buying and selling operation considerably. Joseph grew. He was, as Thomas had predicted, a great deal of trouble in the best possible sense, curious and energetic and social in a way that neither of his parents was exactly, which Susanna attributed to some combination of genes and the accident of personality that produces people who are larger in their engagement with the world than either of their sources. He went to the Caldwell School and was the kind of student who made his teacher's life interesting, not because he was difficult but because he asked questions at unexpected angles and made observations that no one had made before, and that were, on examination, usually worth considering. Clara was more like her father in temperament, quieter and more observant and possessed of a steady inner certainty that she expressed through action rather than words. She had Susanna's gift for making spaces habitable and beautiful, arranging and rearranging the things around her until they were in what she clearly felt was their correct position, which reminded Susanna so powerfully of her own younger self that it made her chest ache with love sometimes, just watching her daughter move through a room with that focused serenity. In 1885, they added the east wing to the house, which gave them 2 more rooms and a proper mudroom and a pantry large enough to hold the full output of the kitchen garden through the preserving season. Thomas designed it this time, with careful reference to Susanna's original plans and her ongoing revisions, and when he showed her the drawings she looked at them for a long time and then looked at him. "You learned to read plans," she said. "I had a good teacher," he said. The construction brought in a crew of 4 from Caldwell and took 3 weeks, and when it was done the house was large and solid and looked as though it had always been exactly this size, which was the mark of good design. That summer Susanna walked through all the rooms of the house, not for any particular purpose, but because she felt the need to take account of it, the way she had taken account of the barn that first week, making her inventory with her eyes. She walked through the kitchen with its big iron range and its wide east windows and its shelves of preserves and its smells of bread and dried herbs, and through the sitting room with its piano and its bookcase and its embroidered cushions, which were not the same as the original ones but were their direct descendants, replaced and refreshed every few years as her skills grew. And through the hallway with Thomas's river stones arranged in a long shallow dish on the windowsill, because she had put them there the second winter and he had said nothing and they had stayed, and through the bedroom that was full of the morning light she had specified, and out onto the porch that faced the sunrise. She sat down on the porch bench, which Thomas had built and which had a back of curved wood and was more comfortable than its appearance suggested, and she looked at the land that was theirs, at the cattle in the far field and the garden in its summer fullness, and the cottonwoods along the path and the windmill turning steadily in the Kansas wind, and she sat there for a long time. Thomas found her there late in the afternoon. He had been out with the cattle and he came up the path with dust on him and his hat pushed back, and he saw her sitting on the porch and he came and sat beside her. He did not ask what she was thinking. He knew her well enough by now to know that she would tell him when she was ready. She was quiet for a while, looking out. Then she said, "Do you remember what you said to me that first day?" He thought. "I said a great many things that day," he said. "You apologized," she said, "for the barn." He was quiet. "You did not need to apologize," she said. "Not because it was fine that you misled me, because it was not fine, but because," she paused, turning the thought carefully, "because the barn was where we started. And what we built from there was ours, not just yours or just mine, both of ours together." She looked at him. "I would not trade the barn, Thomas." He looked at her for a long moment. The evening light was coming on now, golden and lateral, laying itself across the porch and the land beyond with the lavish generosity of late summer evenings in Kansas that seemed to want to make up for all the hard hours of the day. "I would give you 100 houses," he said quietly, "if I could go back and do it right from the beginning." "No," she said. "Do not go back. What we have is because of exactly how we got here, every part of it." He took her hand and held it the way he had always held it, with the full, warm certainty of someone who knows the value of what he is holding. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat on the porch of the house that had grown from a barn and a promise, and the quiet determination of a woman who had never said a word of complaint. And the wind moved through the cottonwoods, and the windmill turned, and the cattle moved in the last light of the field. Their third child was born in October of 1886, a boy they named William, and who was from the first day a combination of both his parents in ways that delighted them and occasionally alarmed them, possessing Susanna's organizational instincts and Thomas's capacity for stillness, and both of their stubborn streaks in full measure, which made him at once the easiest and the most complex of the 3 children to understand. Dorothea James, who had been with them for 7 years by then, sat with William for the first time on the day he came home from the doctor's careful attendance, and she looked at him with the expression of a woman who has seen enough of life to know what matters in it, and she said, "This one is going to be something." "They all are something," Susanna said. "Yes," said Dorothea, "but this one is going to know it." She was right, as it turned out. The 1880s moved forward with the solid momentum of a life that is working as it should, not without its difficulties, but with a fundamental underlying rightness that sustained them through the difficult seasons. Thomas's reputation in the cattle business continued to grow, and in 1887 he was approached by a consortium of Caldwell buyers to serve as a senior assessor for the major drives, which brought him to a different level of the business and required a great deal more travel through the summer drive season. He and Susanna talked about it thoroughly, the way they talked about everything, at the kitchen table with coffee and the account books and their honest assessments. "It will mean I am away more," he said. "I know," she said. "Is it what you want?" He looked at her. "I want to know what you think first," she considered. "I think we have Robbie, who is better with the cattle than you give him credit for and who has been waiting for the chance to prove it. I think we have Dorothea, who manages the household better than I do in some respects. I think we have May in town now, who is near enough to be useful if needed. I think you have worked very hard for 15 years to build something that can sustain itself, and that accepting this position is the natural result of that work." She met his eyes. "And I think you should take it." He was quiet for a moment. "You are the most honest person I have ever known," he said. "I learned it from you," she said. He took the position and was away more through the summer months, and Susanna managed the property with Robbie and Dorothea, and the competent ease of a woman who had been building her capacity to do exactly this for nearly a decade. She also, in the spring of 1888, agreed to teach 2 afternoons a week at the Caldwell school, which had by then a proper schoolhouse and a regular teacher, but which was sufficiently overcrowded during the spring term that additional help was welcome. And she went into town on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons and stood at the front of a classroom again, and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing she had been born to do. Joseph, who was 8, was in her class on those afternoons, which he treated as simultaneously the finest and the most complicated circumstance of his existence, because having your mother as your teacher is a thing that must be managed with considerable social finesse when you are 8 years old and aware of your reputation among your peers. She was scrupulously fair to him, which he complained about to his father on a Thursday evening when Thomas was home from a buying trip, and Thomas listened to his son's grievance with great seriousness and then said, "She is fair to you the same way she is fair to everyone, which is more than fairly. I would not complain about that if I were you." Joseph looked at his father, "But she called on me when I knew the answer so the other children would not think she was favoring me." "And did knowing the answer in front of the class do you any harm?" Thomas asked. Joseph thought about this for a moment. "No," he admitted. "Then I think you should go do your sums," Thomas said, and Joseph went with the expression of someone who has been outmaneuvered by logic and is not entirely happy about it but can see no way around it. Thomas told Susanna about the conversation that evening and she laughed until she had to sit down. "He is exactly like you were as a boy," she said when she could speak again. "I was not." Thomas stopped, looked at her. "How would you know what I was like as a boy?" "Because I can see it perfectly," she said. "The way he comes at a problem from the side looking for the angle, the way he would rather be outsmarted by honest reasoning than win by something clever." She smiled. "He is entirely your son." Thomas sat back in his chair with an expression of deep contentment. "He is also entirely your son," he said. "That stubbornness is from Ohio." The years accumulated, and the Blackwell Ranch became what Thomas had always believed it could be. Not the largest operation in the territory, but a sound and respected one, known for good cattle and fair dealing, and a property that seemed always to be, as one of the Caldwell newspaper correspondents noted in a piece about successful homesteaders, not just a ranch but a genuine home. The correspondent had come out to write the piece and had spent an afternoon on the property and had asked Susanna what she thought was the secret of making a place like this work, and she had thought about it carefully before answering. "You must understand what you are starting with," she said. "Not what you wished you had or what you were promised or what you expected. What is actually here. Because you can only build from what is actually here, and if you spend your energy mourning the gap between what is here and what you wanted, you lose the time you could have spent building." The correspondent had written it down and put it in the piece, and Hector Bream had cut the piece out of the paper and framed it and put it on the wall of the general store, which Susanna thought was slightly excessive, but which Adelaide Bream told her was entirely appropriate, and that was that. Garrett Webb, who had never been a warm man exactly but who had been consistently decent, came to supper one autumn evening in 1889, which was unusual enough that Susanna made the good china come out and put the good tablecloth on. He ate well and talked about cattle prices and the coming changes in the territory, because Kansas had been a state since 1861, and the territories to the south were under increasing pressure for organization and settlement, and Garrett had thoughts about all of it. After supper he sat on the porch with Thomas and Susanna and the older children, Joseph now 10 and Clara 8 and William 3, and he looked out at the property in the evening light with an expression that was, for Garrett Webb, unusually open. "You have made something good here," he said, and it was directed at both of them equally. "We have," Thomas agreed. "I told Thomas when he first came out here," Garrett said, looking at Susanna, "that this land would work you harder than anything you had ever done and give you less than you expected and ask for more than you thought you had." He paused. "I did not account for what you brought to it." "What did I bring?" she asked. He thought about it in the way of a man who does not say things carelessly. "You brought the patience to look at what was actually here," he said, and he searched for the word, the courage to love it anyway. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the land in the last light. Then she said, "It was not courage, it was choice." Garrett Webb nodded slowly, as though this was the answer he had expected and respected. Then he said good night and drove his buggy home through the dark, and Thomas and Susanna sat on the porch a while longer with the lamp burning at the door, and the children inside getting ready for bed, their voices audible through the open window, Joseph arguing a point about something with the relentless specificity he had always had, and Clara answering with her father's quality of stillness, and William contributing a series of sounds that were enthusiastic if not entirely coherent. "I want to tell you something," Thomas said. Susanna turned to look at him. He was watching the land, the dark shapes of the cottonwoods and the stars beginning to show above the line of the fields, and his profile in the lamplight was the profile she knew better than any other face in the world, every line of it familiar and dear. "Tell me," she said. He turned to look at her. 11 years of marriage, and she still felt the quality of his direct attention as something specific and warm, a thing she had not taken for granted in any of those years. "I think about that first day," he said, "standing at the barn door with my hat turning in my hands, watching you step down from the wagon. You were the most composed person I had ever seen. You looked at the barn and you looked at the land and you said," he smiled, "you said it has a good roof." "It did," she said. "Susanna," he took her hand, "I have spent 11 years trying to be worthy of that, of the fact that you looked at what I had and what I was, which was not much and not fully honest, and you stayed and you built and you never—" He stopped. His voice had roughened slightly. "You never said a word, not one word of reproach, not even on the days when you had every reason." "I did not need to," she said. "I know," he said. "That is what I mean." She looked at him for a long moment in the lamplight, this man who had given her a barn and watched her make it a palace, and loved her through every nail and every brushstroke of whitewash and every embroidered cushion and every jar of pickles and every child and every evening on the porch. And she thought that this was perhaps the only kind of love that lasted, the kind that grows from the truth of things, from what is actually here rather than what was promised or expected. "Thomas," she said, "do you know what I thought, that first morning in the barn, when I made biscuits before you came down from the loft?" "Tell me," he said, and the readiness in his voice was the same as always, 11 years of it, the same quality of being available to her truth. "I thought," she said, "that I was going to love this, not just the land and the work, but this." She waved her hand at the house behind them, the lamp in the door, the voices of the children, the windmill turning in the dark. "This specific life, with this specific person." She met his eyes. "I knew it before I knew you, Thomas. Before I knew anything about you, except the stones in the box." He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles slowly, in the old-fashioned manner that she associated with a more formal time, and that he had always done in moments of the most genuine feeling, as though the gesture was not formal at all, but was actually the most natural expression of what he meant. "You are my life," he said simply, "every room of it." The night was large and full of stars, and the wind moved through the cottonwoods, and the lamp burned, and the children's voices continued inside, and the cattle moved in the dark field, and the windmill turned and turned against the Kansas sky. They sat together on the porch they had built from a beginning that was less than promised and more than anyone might have expected, and the house stood behind them, solid on its foundation, warm in all its rooms, and outside the full life of the thing they had made together moved through the dark in its steady, reliable rhythms. And Susanna Blackwell, who had once been Susanna Pritchard with $47 in the hem of her dress and a letter full of promises, leaned against the shoulder of the man she loved and looked out at the life that was theirs and thought, as she had thought many times before and would think many times again, that she would not trade a single day of it. Not even the barn. In the years that followed, the Blackwell property continued to thrive and to grow, not in the aggressive, reckless way of men who mistake size for success, but in the steady, intentional way of people who know what they are building and why. Thomas reduced his time with the Buyers Consortium in 1891, when he felt that the children needed him nearer, and when a particularly brutal summer on the trail made him understand that he had perhaps been proving something to himself for long enough. He came home, and he stayed home, and he and Robbie James managed the expanded herd together with the easy efficiency of two people who have been working in concert long enough to think ahead of each other. Susanna continued to teach twice a week until 1892, when the school took on a full-time teacher from the East, a young woman named Helen Marsh, who was 22 and competent and slightly overwhelmed, and who Susanna mentored through her first year with the generosity of someone who remembers exactly what it felt like to be a new teacher in an unfamiliar place. Helen Marsh became a family friend and a regular presence at Sunday dinners, which Susanna kept as a long-standing Blackwell tradition. The big table in the kitchen extended with the extra leaf Thomas had made, crowded with whoever was in the vicinity and wanted a meal and conversation. Joseph Blackwell grew into a young man who was, as Thomas had predicted, a great deal of interesting trouble, who went to the Agricultural College in Manhattan, Kansas, in 1897, and came back 2 years later with a head full of new ideas about cattle breeding and land management that he brought to his father with the combination of certainty and deference that is the mark of a son who has learned from a good man and knows it. Thomas listened to all of it with full attention and adopted about half of it immediately and argued about the other half in the constructive way of two people who respect each other and disagree in good faith. And the half that he argued about was implemented in the following year after further discussion and proved, on the whole, sound. Clara Blackwell turned out, at 15, to have an extraordinary aptitude for the piano that Susanna recognized immediately, and that Thomas promptly did something about, arranging for a proper teacher to come from Caldwell twice a week, an elderly German man named Professor Heinrich Baum, who had come west with the railroad in the 1860s and had been playing and teaching in Caldwell since, and who declared Clara to be the most naturally gifted student he had taught in 15 years. She played with a quality that made the household stop what it was doing and listen without meaning to. And by the time she was 20, she was playing for the Caldwell church services and giving small concerts at the hotel for the social occasions that the town of Caldwell organized now that it was well past its wildest years, and becoming something more like an ordinary town and less like the end of the trail. William Blackwell was, as Dorothea James had predicted, something, though what exactly he was took years to fully become clear. He had his mother's organizational intelligence and his father's depth, and he turned out to have additionally a mathematical aptitude that neither parent could fully account for. He became, eventually, a surveyor, which seemed to everyone who knew him to be exactly right, because it combined the precision and the love of land that were both fundamental to who he was. Dorothea James lived with the Blackwells until she was 62 years old, when she decided to go and live near May and Paul in Caldwell, who by then had 3 children of their own and a comfortable house, and a standing invitation to her mother to come and be near the grandchildren. She left on a bright morning in 1895 in Paul's wagon, with more luggage than she had arrived with and the careful deliberateness of someone who is not saying goodbye to place, but rather moving from one part of a life to another. Susanna stood in the yard and held Dorothea's hands and looked at her. "You gave me more than you know," Susanna said. "You gave me a home when I had none," Dorothea said. "The accounting is not hard." They held each other for a moment, and then Dorothea climbed into the wagon and Paul drove her into town, and Susanna went inside and stood in the kitchen, and was quiet for a little while with the house around her. And then she rolled up her sleeves and began to make bread, because bread was a thing that required attention, and she found she needed something that required attention. Thomas came in from the fields at midday and found her floury and composed, and he sat at the kitchen table and drank his coffee and waited, because 11 years and then 17 and now it was 1895, and they had been married for 17 years, and he knew her in all her seasons, which was the deepest form of knowledge there was. She said finally, "It is strange when a person who has been constant in your life leaves, even when they are going somewhere good." "Yes," he said. "I am not unhappy," she clarified. "I know," he said. She looked at him across the kitchen with its windows and its shelves and its warmth. "Thank you," she said. He tilted his head. "For what?" "For being constant," she said. "For being here." He set down his coffee cup. He stood up from the table and came around it, and he put his arms around her, floury as she was, and she leaned against him with the ease of someone who has been resting in the same place for a long time and has found it unfailingly reliable. "Always," he said. She believed him. She had believed him for 17 years, and she intended to go on believing him for as many more as they were given. The house stood on the Kansas prairie, and the cottonwoods grew larger every year, and the windmill turned as it always had turned, in all weather and all seasons, its reliable rotation something that the Blackwell children would remember for the rest of their lives as the sound and sight of home. The cattle grazed in the fields and the garden produced, and the root cellar filled every fall, and the piano played on Sunday evenings when the family gathered in the sitting room and Clara played, and the others listened or sang, depending on whether they could carry a tune, Thomas making a creditable attempt at the bass line of hymns and Joseph singing with the confident enthusiasm of someone who is aware that he cannot sing particularly well and does not see why that should stop him. In the summer of 1897, on an evening in June when the light was long and golden, and the meadowlarks were calling in the field, Susanna and Thomas sat on the porch in the chairs that had replaced the original bench, 2 proper rocking chairs that Thomas had made the previous winter from a pattern she had found in one of her books. They rocked slowly and looked at the land, and Thomas said, "Do you remember what the barn looked like when you first came?" "Very well," she said. "Do you remember what you said, that it had a good roof?" "I remember." "I have been thinking about that for 20 years, he said. She glanced at him. "You have been thinking about a barn for 20 years." "I have been thinking about you," he said, and what it meant that you could look at something that was less than it was supposed to be and find what was good in it and start from there. He rocked slowly. "I have tried to do that all my life with varying success, but I had never seen it done so." He searched for the word. "So naturally, as though it was simply the way you saw things, the correct way, and the rest of us were squinting in the wrong direction." She thought about this for a moment. The meadowlark called again, 3 clear notes. "My mother," she said slowly, "had a saying. She used to say that the world will always give you something to work with if you are willing to do the work." She paused. "I think she was right. I have found it to be right anyway." Thomas reached across the space between the rocking chairs and took her hand. His hand was less rough than it had once been, the years having worn the sharpest edges smooth, but it was still large and warm and entirely his. "Susanna," he said, What would you say if you were writing it for someone who needed to hear it? What would you say about all of it? The barn, the house, the life. She thought about it in the way she thought about everything important, without hurry, looking at it from multiple angles before she answered. I would say, she said at last, that a promise is a beginning, not a certainty, and that what you build from a beginning depends entirely on what you bring to it. I would say that I was promised a home and given a barn, and that I made the barn a home and then a house and then a life. She turned to look at him. And I would say that I was also given a man who kept trying, who was honest when it mattered and who held my hand when I needed it and learned to build better because I showed him how, and who has been worth every mile of the journey. She pressed his hand. That is what I would write. He was quiet for a long moment. The sun was going down now, spreading itself in long orange and rose bands across the western sky, and the land caught the light and gave it back softened and warm. That, he said, is the best thing anyone has ever said to me. She smiled. I know. They rocked on the porch of the house she had made into a palace from a barn and a promise, and the quiet determination of a woman who understood that love, real love, the kind that lasts and builds and deepens into something like bedrock, was not about what you were given at the beginning. It was about what you made from it. And what they had made together on the Kansas prairie in the years after 1878 was everything. The windmill turned. The meadowlark called. The children's voices came from inside the house, grown voices now, warm and familiar as the rooms they moved through, and the long evening light lay over all of it, the fields and the fences and the garden and the cottonwoods, with the generous abundance of a summer evening that does not know how to be anything but beautiful. Thomas Blackwell held his wife's hand in the gathering dusk, and she held his, and the rocking chairs moved slowly on the porch he had built from the plans she had drawn, and behind them the house stood solid and full and lit from within, and they sat together in the good quiet of a life well lived, and they were content. They were more than content. They were home.